the 2010 Atlanta Press Club Debates, brought to you live from Georgia Public Broadcasting. Now, the race for the 8th Congressional District.
And good evening, I'm Frank Malloy, anchor of Eyewitness News on 13 WMAZ in Macon. We would like to welcome our viewers on television, our listeners on GPB radio, and our live studio audience to the 2010 Atlanta Press Club Debate Series, originating from the studios of GPB. Now, this is the debate between the candidates in Georgia's 8th Congressional District. Now, the 8th Congressional District is located in Middle and South Georgia. It includes all or portions of 21 counties. Some of the largest cities in the district include Macon, Tifton, Warner Robins, Moultrie, and Dublin. Now let's meet the candidates. They are in alphabetical order. Jim Marshall is the incumbent. He is serving his 4th term as the Democratic congressman from Georgia's 8th District. And Austin Scott, the Republican nominee, owns an independent insurance brokerage in Tifton. Now, our format tonight: first round, candidates will each answer a question from one of our 3 panelists. In the second round, each candidate will ask a question of his opponent. There will be an opportunity for rebuttal in the second round. And in the third round, the panelists will continue questioning the candidates. Finally, each candidate will have 30 seconds to make a closing statement. Before we get started, we'd like to meet our 3 panelists selected by the Atlanta Press Club, giving their time tonight. First, we have Josephine Bennett, reporter for GPB Radio in Macon. Next, we have Andre Jackson, editorial editor for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And our third and final panelist is Susan Percy, editor for Georgia Trend magazine. All right, we're done with the formalities. Let's get started with the debate. In the first round, the candidates will be asked a question by one of our panelists. The candidate will have 60 seconds to answer the question. Josephine Bennett, you will ask the first question of Austin Scott.
Mr. Scott, you say you would have voted against the so-called stimulus package, yet Georgia has received $3.6 billion. Would people here be better off had we not received that money?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. If you know, China received almost $2 billion to create jobs over there. So I believe that we would have done better not to have received that stimulus money because of the debt that was put on the backs of our children, the $787 billion that has now got to be repaid by the American working people.
All right, Andre Jackson is next up. He will ask a question of Jim Marshall. Mr. Jackson.
Representative Marshall, in this election, what distinction should voters see between fiscally conservative Democrats and Republicans?
Well, I've been an independent since I've been in Congress. I just take issues one at a time. I try to do what's best for my country, for the folks that I represent, and I would continue to do that. And I think people know that of me now. They know that I'm a conservative Democrat who tries to reflect the values of those that he represents and advance their interests. And I think that's the choice that they have to make. It's whether or not to retain me in office. They're satisfied. They think I have experience. They think I'm effective, that I can get things done, that I'm honest, that I tell the truth when I talk with people. And I think that's probably what they'll just make their decisions based on.
All right, that will conclude round 1. It is now time for the candidates to question each other. 30 seconds for the question, 60 seconds for the answer, and 30 seconds for a rebuttal if needed. Mr. Scott, you will start your question for Mr. Marshall.
Congressman Marshall, you claim to be a fiscal conservative, yet you voted for Barack Obama's failed stimulus bill, costing the taxpayers $787 billion and spending nearly $2 billion of that to create jobs in China and sending millions in payments to inmates and dead people. I want you to tell Georgians, Congressman, did you not read the bill, or did you read it, see this waste, and not care to stop it?
The stimulus bill has been looked at real hard by different economists, and one of them is Mark Zandi. Mark Zandi was John McCain's economist. Zandi and Alan Blinder got together and they published something that's called How the Great Recession Was Brought to an End in July of 2010. Happy to provide you a copy. It's easy to find. And what they do is basically they model what would happen had we done nothing at all, and what would happen simply with the fiscal response, what would happen with the monetary response. And basically, had we done nothing at all, we'd be in a second Great Depression. Our GDP would be 11.5% lower. Our employment would be 8.5 million less. And we'd be experiencing a budget deficit of $2 trillion this year. Next year, $2.6 trillion. The year after that, $2.25 trillion. The fiscal stimulus package that started with Bush, continued through Obama, it totals about $1 trillion alone, is responsible for 3.4% of the improvement in the GDP, 2.7 million jobs. Now, recently, Zandy has come out and said that we ought not to extend the Bush tax cuts, cut off the Bush tax cuts at $250,000. The same fella. He said that would cost us 770,000 jobs.
That's all the time we have for that, Mr. Marshall. Mr.
Thanks.
Scott, you have 30 seconds if you'd like to weigh in.
Congressman, you voted for the $800 billion stimulus. You voted for the $700 billion Wall Street bailout. You voted for 87% of the spending bills that have become law. You voted to raise the debt ceiling to $14 trillion. And the fact is, you're simply not being honest when you say that you're for a balanced budget, when you look at the Georgia voters and tell them that on the TV.
All right, Mr. Marshall, it is now your turn to ask a question of Austin Scott.
You voted against a law that would impose a transfer tax on people who are illegally here trying to transfer money out of the country. And in explaining that, you've explained it different ways, but at one point you said that you believed immigration reform, and I think this is a quote, should be about protecting America, not punishing individuals. Could you explain what you mean by that? How do you go about doing that?
Absolutely, Congressman. And you know, I read the bills before we vote on them. And if you had taken the opportunity to read that bill, you would have seen that banks, credit unions, savings and loan institutions, the United States Post Office were all exempted from that wire transfer fee. It simply did not make sense to make Western Union the enforcer of what Congress has failed to do. Congressman Marshall, it's you and the others that are up there in Washington that have failed to secure the border. You failed to address the issue of immigration reform. And quite honestly, if you want to know why we have the problem of immigration, it is in Washington, D.C., Congressman, and some of you are going to have to be replaced before we get that issue addressed.
Mr. Marshall, you have 30 seconds if you'd like to weigh in.
Yeah, I'm going to be real quickly. I'd like you to answer my question. Your quote was, should be about protecting America, not punishing individuals. And when you commented on the House floor concerning the specific transfer tax that was to be imposed upon illegal immigrants, you said that we shouldn't be punishing these people, we shouldn't be hurting these people, they're just poor folks trying to help their families. So could you tell us what you mean when you say we shouldn't be focused on individuals, we should be generally focused on protecting America?
Congressman Marshall, that debate is very public, and you have access to the transcript of it, and you know that in that debate I said that Congress had failed to secure the border, that we needed to put an end to birthright citizenship, and that we needed people in Washington, D.C. that were going to pay more than lip service to this issue of immigration reform, which is all that you have done.
All right, we're now going to move on. That concludes our second round. Now, for those who just now may be joining us, this is the debate between the candidates for Georgia's 8th Congressional District. For our third round, we will return to our panel of journalists who will ask questions of the candidate of his or her choice. The candidate will be allowed 60 seconds to respond. As moderator, I will then determine if a rebuttal is necessary. We'll begin this round of questioning with Susan Percy. Susan.
My question is for Mr. Scott. I'm wondering what you would have done differently from Mr. Marshall during the last 2 years had you been in office, if there are any specific bills that he supported that you would have voted against, if there are any points of agreement that you have with him?
Well, first and foremost, I would have never voted for Nancy Pelosi to be the Speaker of the House of Representatives. I think that is the one thing that you can start with right there. And had she not been the Speaker of the House of Representatives, then I think you would have had open and honest dialogue of what should have been done over the last couple of years with regard to the economy. So when you talk about the things that I would not have supported that he has supported, he co-sponsored and voted for card check. I would have never co-sponsored or voted for card check. He voted to raise the national debt to $14 trillion. I have an 11-year-old son, Wells. For my generation and for Wells, we're going to have to pay that money back. I would have never voted to raise the national debt like that. So yes, ma'am, there are many issues that we would have voted quite differently on.
Marshall, you got 30 seconds. You'd like to respond?
Well, I'm sure there are many differences between us. What I do, as I said, is try and take each vote as they come without regard to party interests and try and figure out what's best for the country. And in essence, that's the way I vote. It's the way I've voted for a long time. I could talk about specific votes if you want to, but basically that's how I do it.
All right, the next question will come from Josephine Bennett. Josephine.
Mr. Marshall, you've generally been very supportive of a strong defense and veterans. Would you consider defense cuts in order to reduce the budget and the deficit? And how do you do that and protect Robins Air Force Base at the same time?
There are obviously efficiencies that we can introduce where the Defense Department is concerned, and we're working on that. The Defense Department is very cost conscious right now. But we're in 2 wars. This would be the wrong time for us to be even discussing cutting a defense budget. Hopefully Iraq is winding down. We're actively involved in Afghanistan. We are going to have challenges where defense is concerned in the future, and I think people are going to demand that we spend more money on our security overall. I think Robbins is well poised for the future. I think it's incredibly important to our national defense. And I think really the best thing we could do is get health care right, health care reform correct, and that would dramatically reduce our federal debt. And in the long run, we're going to have to tighten our belts across a whole range of different subjects. Hopefully, we're not at war, and we are able to cut back on defense spending.
Our next question will come from Andre Jackson. Andre.
Mr. Scott, which would be, in your opinion, the largest burden on the U.S. economy, either maintaining the status quo on immigration or paying for an Arizona-style immigration reform that groups like the Georgia Municipal Association say will cost up to $45 a day per inmate for each person who's arrested on immigration offenses?
Clearly maintaining the status quo is the greatest threat to America and our economy. I mean, what Congress has done is absolutely ridiculous. They have not secured the border. They have not protected the integrity of our laws or our lands. And so I think that the status quo is the worst possible thing that we could do with regard to immigration.
Susan Percy, you are up next with our next question.
I'd like to ask Mr. Marshall, having to do with immigration, is there any legislation you would support that might include a path to citizenship for individuals who are already in the United States?
No, I have a piece of legislation which does none of that. What it does is dramatically enhance our electronic employment verification process. It increases very dramatically penalties on employers, both civil and criminal, that employers who fail to use the electronic verification process would suffer. And then it gets rid of what's referred to as the subcontractor exemption. I frankly think the problem we have here is that people come for jobs. That's the principal reason that they come. And if we can cut off the jobs, that's the most effective, cost-effective way for us to stop the flow of illegal immigrants coming into the country. I've voted for every piece of legislation that would improve our defense along the border, increasing border patrol, increasing funding for ICE, etc. But I think the fundamental way of dealing with this problem is not to grant amnesty and incur more of it. The fundamental way to deal with this problem is to go ahead and stop the jobs.
All right, we continue with our panelist questions. Josephine Bennett with GPB Radio in Macon will ask our next question. Josephine.
Mr. Scott, if you had just one specific legislative goal you were able to achieve in Congress, one that differentiates you from your opponent, what would that be?
You know, I would, if I could only write one piece of legislation, it would be the first time that you failed a drug test would be the last time that you received an unemployment check.
All righty, straight to the point. All right, Andre Jackson, your turn to ask the next question.
Okay, Representative Marshall, what should Congress do, or at the federal level in general, what needs to be done further to help resolve Georgia's water woes?
The federal government, I'm afraid, is going to have a role to play in this because the three states that are in dispute can't seem to get together. Mm-hmm. I have told my colleagues in Florida and Alabama, I didn't ask them, I told them that they were not going to cut off Georgia's water supply, Atlanta's water supply, where the Chattahoochee is concerned, that I wanted one of them to stand up and say that they were, and none of them did. So we're at the federal level in agreement that some reasonable withdrawal of water from the Chattahoochee for the Atlanta metro region is going to occur. The question is going to wind up being the details. What I'm hopeful of is that the governors, they've been working at it, that they can get together and resolve this. There's a deadline that's looming as a result of the court decision. So if the governors can't seem to make progress, then it's going to be up to the federal delegation. Unfortunately, this is a national issue. There are lots of different places that have the same issue. So getting something done is going to be challenging. But one thing for sure, we're not going to cut off Atlanta's water, and nobody's going to vote to do that.
Our next question will come from Susan Percy. She's with Georgia Trend magazine. Susan.
Mr. Scott, I'd like to ask you a question about immigration. Assuming that no legislation passed that offered a path to citizenship, how would you propose to deal with the 10 or 12 million undocumented or illegal workers who are here now?
Yes, ma'am. I think we just simply have to return them to their homeland, just as the way we do it right now with those that we're able to catch. It's just that we would have to step up the number of people and resources in those positions.
Josephine Bennett, you are next in line for a question of the candidate of your choosing.
Mr. Marshall, you voted against the health care bill. If you could write your own health care bill, what provisions would be in it and why?
What I do is start where we are and gradually migrate toward a system that has a real functioning market. We don't have one in our current health care scheme, and that's because of what's referred to as the third-party payer system. 88 cents of every dollar paid for health care services comes from either an insurance company or the government. And as a result of this health care bill, it's going to increase. What I'd head in the direction of is catastrophic policies with the insurance company not really being involved in health care until you get to the catastrophic level. Health savings accounts and health savings accounts that roll and catastrophic policies that roll, so that more consumers are actively engaged with their physicians talking about cost. What would happen is the standard of care would change dramatically and costs would drop dramatically. We could save as much as $600 billion a year if we could just migrate back to a reasonable free market system where health care is concerned. It's terribly important to the future of the country that people understand this. I published a piece in the National Review, and folks can pull that up. I've got it on my website.
Mr. Scott, you'd like to weigh in?
Absolutely. Congressman Marshall, with all due respect, you sat back there, you did nothing, you said nothing, you waited until there were 218 votes to pass the piece of legislation, and then you walked down and cast a vote no. You came home and said, well, I voted against it, but then you said you wouldn't vote to repeal it. And now after the campaign heated up, you turn around and refer to it as a disaster that must be repealed. Why didn't you fight to stop that health care piece of legislation that you refer to as a disaster before it passed?
Mr. Marshall?
I wrote extensively about it before it passed. I appeared any number of times on Fox and local news shows. I talked about it in all of my town hall meetings. And this started, roughly July of last year. And I was consistent through that entire period of time. The bill, as it was taking shape, is a disaster for the country. It's going to help a lot of people. It's going to hurt a lot of people. But generally what it's going to do is dramatically increase costs. And we can't afford it. And so I've been opposed to this since about July of last year when I finally figured out what a disaster it was. And I've been extremely vocal. And it's just untrue to suggest otherwise. All
right, we're going to move on now. Andre Jackson, editorial editor for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. It's your turn with a question.
Okay, my question is for Mr. Scott. You mentioned repeal in your last comment of the health care bill. What solutions would you use and propose to cover the uninsured in this country that we currently all pay for indirectly under the present system, if you can call it that, of health care?
Well, first of all, many simply choose not to purchase insurance. And the idea that the federal government should be allowed to require them to purchase a product that they don't want to purchase, I believe violates their constitutional right not to purchase that insurance if they choose not to. Now, do the states have the rights to do things? Maybe. But the United States Constitution does not give the federal government the authority to impose the additional taxes and fees on citizens if they choose not to purchase that health insurance product.
All right, we continue with our questions. Susan Percy, you're up next.
I'd like to follow up with Mr. Scott. Are there any provisions of the health care bill as passed that you support or that you would like to keep?
No, ma'am, there aren't. There simply are not.
All right, we'll move on. Josephine Bennett, it's your turn.
Mr. Marshall, we can talk about health care, we can talk about immigration, but I think what a lot of Georgians, most Georgians, really deeply care about right now is the economy. What plans do you specifically have that would benefit Georgians when it comes to unemployment and when it comes to helping our economy here?
We've done an awful lot at the federal level, most of which I've supported, to stop this collapse, to stop it from becoming the second Great Depression, which is where it was headed toward. I just recited the figures from Mark Zandi, who is cited by both sides, and lots of economists have weighed in on this. At this point, most of what additional things we would do, I would hope we would pay for as we do it. We might do some additional things, but I think the economy is picking up now. You can see it in where manufacturers, where hard orders are concerned. You can see it in the stock market. And I think we're headed in the right direction. And frankly, the government can't do all this for us. We're going to have to do it for ourselves. The government can stop something from slowing down, but basically the government needs to back off on the spending, tighten its belt, show some confidence that it can get its debt under control, and I think the economy itself will take over and take care of the needs of Georgians.
Andre Jackson, we'll move on to you now for your next question.
Okay, my question is for Mr. Scott. Much is said these days about getting the federal government out of the way of this or that. Flipping that around a little bit, what should Washington, if you are elected, champion? What should they be out in front of that will best help get Georgians and people in the United States as a nation back to work and in a more competitive global economy?
Oh, absolutely. As a small business owner, I understand that we need to champion private sector job growth. And the way to encourage that private sector job growth is to stop the discussions about cap and trade. Stop the discussions about this horrible card check bill that Jim Marshall co-sponsored and voted for with that arbitration clause that is driving jobs overseas. So I think that if you look at America and America industry, there is a lot of cash sitting on the sideline. If we had a tax policy for 2011, I think that would have helped to get the economy back on track. But the Democrats in Congress chose to adjourn without a tax policy for 2011. How irresponsible could a group of individuals be?
Mr. Marshall, you have 30 seconds. Do you wish to rebut?
Well, I don't know that a rebuttal is really called for as much as I would say that the government has an awful lot to do with what our trade policies are, and it also has a lot to do with exchange rates. We're working on exchange rates, but they are used strategically by countries like China to disadvantage us economically. And then our trade policies have been basically a disaster. There's no strategic thought. It's largely driven by money, and we're exporting the fundamental economic strength of the United States. So that's a clear example of what the federal government can do to assist where the economy long-term in the United States is concerned.
All right, we now move on with our question. Susan Percy with Georgia Trend Magazine. Susan.
My question is for Mr. Scott. Bipartisanship is something that we hear a lot about, but we don't seem to see much of it. Can you name some specific areas where you believe the congressional Democrats and Republicans are close enough to make a bipartisan solution feasible, or is that just completely off the table?
I almost think, if I can, and this might not be the answer that you're looking for, but I almost think it's a generational issue. I think for my generation as a Republican, when I'm talking to a 40-year-old Democrat, we understand that we have to work together to solve some of the problems. I think the generations that are ahead of us that have been in control of this country for so long are not willing to work together because they're stuck in their ways. And so for those of us in my generation that are 40 years old, we understand that if we get to a position where we agree on 90% of it, then it's time to move forward on that particular issue. And I think it's more of a generational thing.
Could you be specific about some of the issues that you feel are ripe for some bipartisan action?
I think jobs in the economy. I think private sector job growth is something that when you take small business owners, 40-year-old small business owners that are Democrats and 40-year-old small business owners that are Republicans, we're going to agree on reducing the federal control and the rules and regulations over our businesses.
Mr. Marshall, 30 seconds to respond.
It's not really a response. I mean, I sort of agree with what he just said. The problem is the institution itself. There are very few members of Congress that have voting records like mine, records that just pick it issue by issue. And lately I've been about 60% toward the Republican side of substantive views and about 40% toward the Democratic side. That just doesn't happen. There are only about 40 or 50 of us that do that, and it's because there's such discipline on the Republican side that they don't vary from what their leadership wants on substantive issues. And on the Democratic side, too many safe seats, too many extreme views on both sides, frankly. It's a real problem for the country.
Josephine Bennett with GPB Radio in Macon. You have our next question.
Mr. Scott, earlier you said when it came to 12 million illegal immigrants, you would send them all home. For Georgia's agriculture community,
yes, ma'am,
a lot of those immigrants are very important, and all of them are not legal, that are here helping our farmers get their crops to market. Is that kind of a blanket statement, and is it realistic?
Well, we have the H-2A program that allows farm labor to come in and then leave once the crops are picked. And those farmers who are abiding by the rules and paying those additional fees to abide by the rules are at a competitive disadvantage to farmers who are not. So I think that that the work permit program is there. I think we need to make some adjustments to that work permit program, but I think there's a way to make sure that we have an adequate number of work permits to pick the crops and to make sure that we protect our agricultural economy and not have the continued expansion of illegal immigrants. And one of the things I will tell you that I'm adamant that we need to address in this country is this issue of birthright citizenship. The child of somebody who was born here illegally should not be a United States citizen.
Andre Jackson, Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Our next question, please.
My question is for Mr. Scott. What would be the largest two things in your sights if you were elected to reduce federal spending?
Well, again, I think that the first thing I would address, it goes back to the one issue. You know, if we have people who are unemployed and receiving an unemployment check because they failed a drug test when they went and applied for the job, I would make sure that anybody who was receiving social programs was not using illegal drugs. And by definition, if we're giving them a check and they're purchasing illegal drugs, then we are enabling that activity, and that's something that needs to be stopped. So the thing I will tell you is that with regard to the federal government, I think that the bureaucracy as a whole, the number of federal employees that have been put on the payrolls in the last 2 years is probably the first place we could look for significant budget reductions and get the number of federal employees back down to the level that they were in 2008.
Mr. Marshall?
Well, I agree with most of what's been said. There's savings to be had there, but that's not much. The biggest savings that we could make would be to get health care right. And it would be relatively painless. It would be a win-win for everybody because costs would go down, access would go up. And it's huge money. The Medicare trustees estimate that the current liability for Medicare into the future is about $37 trillion. We've got to do something about that.
All right. Susan Percy, you have our next question for one of our candidates.
Mr. Scott, you alluded to the costly bureaucracy, and yet you have said that you believe that drug tests should be administered to welfare recipients. And also earlier you said that you thought individuals who are in the country illegally, the 10 or 12 million, should be sent home. Do you believe these two things could be accomplished without adding to the bureaucracy?
I think that you could turn around and reduce the bureaucracy in certain areas and hire people that were actually the boots on the ground getting the job done. And I'm talking about, when I'm talking about boots on the ground, I'm talking about the people that are carrying out the work. We've got too many bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. telling bureaucrats in Atlanta, Georgia what to tell bureaucrats at the local level. And it is a waste of tax dollars, not only at the federal level, but at the state level and the local level. And so, yes, ma'am, I believe that we could reduce the bureaucracy and still have the number of employees that it took to get the job done.
Jim Marshall, 30 seconds.
Well, I think that if we did what I'd like to see done where illegal immigration is concerned, and that is cut off the jobs, you'd have a lot of people who would want to leave because they can't make a living here. So you'd have a little bit of help. And without that help, you're right. You're quite right. This is an enormous task. And it seems to me the most cost-effective way to address it is by using the market and cutting off the reason that people come here.
Josephine Bennett with GPB Radio in Macon. You will ask the next question, please.
Mr. Marshall, you're considered conservative by Democratic standards. What philosophies of yours, if any, are inherently Democratic?
You know, I don't think of myself as having Democratic or Republican philosophies. I think of myself as worrying about the country and the folks that I represent and the future for my kids. And those are American issues, and I feel pretty strongly about them. And then what you see if you watch my voting is I just sort of pick them, and I'll go. I never think anything it's rare that something that's controversial that we vote on is ideal. I mean, they all have problems with them. They're not the way that I would have drafted them precisely in almost every instance. But what I do is I don't approach things from, well, let me think about this from a Democratic perspective or a Republican perspective, but what's best for the country. And as I said, the way things have been going on substantive issues lately, I'm a little shaded toward the Republican side than to the Democratic side, but I'm in the middle is where I am, and that's where most Americans are. And you want to keep people in Congress who have the guts to stay there. It's really hard to do.
Mr. Scott, 30 seconds.
Congressman, with due respect, you vote with Nancy Pelosi 90% of the time, roughly 90% of the time. On the fiscal issues, you vote with her on a higher percentage of the time than that. You voted for the $800 billion stimulus bill. You voted for the $700 billion Wall Street bailout. You voted for 87% of every spending bill that becomes law. And you voted to raise the debt ceiling to $14 trillion. The truth of the matter is you are a fiscal liberal.
May I?
Yes.
They've had these ads saying that I vote with Nancy Pelosi 90% of the time. And the New York Times, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution have come out and said they're just utterly false. They've said that the highest figure you could possibly get, if you take into account all of the feel-good votes like naming post offices, etc., is about 66% of the time. The National Journal rates your voting record on a fairly regular basis.
Absolutely.
And the National Journal has me, and during the time that Ms. Pelosi has been the Speaker, I was 55% no, 40% yes one year, 56.5 the next year, 58.5. In disagreement with her on the bills that the National Journal looked at as the substantive bills defining the differences between the two parties.
All right, we need to move on now. Our next question will come from Andre Jackson. Andre.
Okay, Representative Marshall, you spoke a moment ago about your worries about the future of this nation. What worries you the most about the status of civil discourse in this country as we discuss substantive issues at a critical time?
Well, we have way too much soundbite stuff going on and people willing to just sort of tell untruths in order to secure political advantage. It's sort of the end justifies the means philosophy. And Americans are really busy. There's not, it used to be that if you turned on the TV and you left it on at about 6 or 7 or 8 o'clock at night, you're going to see TV shows. And they'd be more or less saying the same thing. Now it's all over the book. Lots of Americans don't pay any attention to this stuff. We have huge issues facing us, and the discourse is really awful. And there are very few calm, measured voices out there. I'd cite David Brooks with the New York Times as one of them. I've gotten to the point with a lot of these folks, I don't waste my time reading what they write or watching their TV shows, because I know it's not intended to tell the truth. It's intended to skew things for a political view, to advantage a political view one way or the other. I don't know how you stop that, but it does take a lot of good people coming together and recognizing that that's what's going on and just not tolerating it.
Scott, you care to talk about this for 30 seconds?
You know, again, you know, this end justifies the means, win at all cost politics is something that my family and I are feeling right now, and I think we'll have plenty of time to discuss that later. But again, I want to go back to the fact, you know, you voted for the $800 billion stimulus, you voted for the $700 billion Wall Street bailout, you voted for 87% of every spending bill that has become law, you voted to raise the debt ceiling to $14 trillion. But when it all politics has got you on TV looking at the general public and telling them that you're in favor of a balanced budget.
We need to move on quickly. We got time for one final question. That'll come from Susan Percy, and the candidate who's chosen will only have 30 seconds to respond. Susan?
My question is for Mr. Marshall. During the primary, I believe something like 20% of Georgians turned out to vote, and I suppose the expectation is that it will be a higher turnout, but still nothing decisive. Do you believe that the generally negative tones of campaigns has contributed to the low voter turnout?
30 seconds, Mr. Marshall.
Both sides tend to turn voters off. You could imagine McDonald's and Burger King across the street from one another, telling the public the other one's going to kill you. You know, it's going to their meat is poison, and we do that enough. The public doesn't go to either, and that's kind of what's going on where politics is concerned. It's a very uncivil level of discourse, and it's really unfortunate for the country.
All right, that is our final question. No more time for questions. Each of the candidates in the election for the 8th Congressional District will now have 30 seconds for a closing statement. Our first closing statement will come from Austin Scott.
Well, thank you. And as your congressman, I want to promise you this. I'm going to vote in Washington the same way I speak in Georgia. I'm going to go up there and work to create jobs in Georgia. I understand that the economy is the #1 issue. We're going to get the federal government off the backs of the small business owner, and we're going to let them drive this car out of the ditch and get America back to work.
Our final closing statement, 30 seconds, will come from Jim Marshall.
Well, thank you for all of this. I appreciate it very much. I grew up in tough times. My first job was 75 cents an hour. I for a long time there, as a laborer, mechanic, school teacher, just did what I could to make ends meet. We've gone through tough times like this before. If we can pull together and stop the extremists on both sides and have some sensible policies that work for America, we've got great days ahead of us, and I think people just need to believe that and have some confidence that that's what's going to occur.
All right, that'll wrap it up. Jim Marshall, Austin Scott, thank you very much. We certainly appreciate you taking time to be with us. Josephine Bennett, Andre Jackson, Susan Percy, thank you for taking your time to act as our panelists today. And that does conclude our debate. The general elections will be Tuesday, November 2nd. Early voting is going on right now. Our thanks to the candidates, as we said, and to our panel of journalists. We'd also like to thank the Atlanta Press Club for arranging this debate so we could hear where the candidates stand. For more information about the Atlanta Press Club, you may visit atlantapressclub.org. The debates that air on Georgia Public Broadcasting will be archived on the Press Club's website. Now, this particular broadcast has been streamed live and will be available on demand on GPB's website, gpb.org. I'm Frank Malloy. Thanks very much for joining us for this general election debate. We invite you now to stay with GPB for the 12th Congressional District debate, and that's coming up next. Thank you.
The Atlanta Press Club debate series is made possible in part by donations from the late Tom Watson Brown and Emory University. The 2010 Atlanta Press Club debates, brought to you live from Georgia Public Broadcasting.